apparently, Steve wanted to introduce me. I don't know if this is a good idea, but how do I turn this on? A couple of boomers. How many boomers does it take to turn on a handheld mic? That looks like it.
Hello.
All right.
Hello, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not the guy speaking. I just, last minute thing, I said, hey, can I introduce you? So I just met this guy a little while ago. But in order to introduce you, I need you to take off one of your shoes.
Oh, jeez. Do you know how long it takes to lace these up?
I don't care, not my problem. He's picked the left foot. What does that tell you? I don't know.
You want
and
my
the
shoe?
sock. Sock's got to come off too. And I hope those feet don't
I got ski socks on.
Wow. This guy's full of excuses. He must be embarrassed of his feet. I don't know why. Aside from that big bandage on. Come here. Right. Come here. Can you put your foot up there?
No, I can't. Not at my age.
Yeah, I think you can. Here. Put it right here. Put it right here.
Okay.
Put your foot right here. Can everybody see his foot? That's a fine looking foot. It's got a nice taper to it. And I guess universally this one on the end here would be termed the baby toe. Is that right? You've all heard of the baby toe? Then this would be maybe the little sister, little brother, the mommy, and of course the daddy. Is that hurt?
Nope.
No. So mommy and daddy, these would be the parent toes. This is Emmanuel parent toe.
Oh boy, you're fired, Steve. All right, give me a second to put my socks back on. Oy. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for coming. And because we're at church, we're going to start with a prayer. Dear Lord, we just come together, and the only thing we want is to know the truth. And we want to preach the truth. We want to discuss the truth. We want the truth to reign in our hearts and minds. We just pray that you would help us to do that and bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So what is happening? If you're here, I'm assuming you want to know what's going on. And I'm here to try and help you to figure out what's going on. Now, in the last 2 years, most people I talk to don't realize how large scale of a historical event we're living through right now. And we've really have succumbed to a sort of apathy of the scale of the changes that are going on. For example, at no time in history ever have so few people been in control of so many people's behavior on so many levels. What you put on your face, how many people you can have in your house, can you even go to work? That has never occurred ever in history. We're living through the greatest wealth transfer in the history of the world, all from the lower and middle classes to the billionaire class. We are living through the largest health crisis, mental health crisis in the youth, in the West, in the history of the world. And we are living through the greatest destruction of small and medium-sized businesses. Just take a look at this. It took 3 years of the Great Depression, from 1929 to 1932, to hit the 15% unemployment mark. Okay? 3 years of the Great Depression. We hit 15% unemployment at the end of April 2020, in 1 month of the lockdowns. Now, had the lockdowns continued as severely as they'd started, we would have absolutely crashed the economy. Now, fortunately, they let some steam up. But this is how much different. The Great Depression was an organic response to a market crash, whereas this was a socially engineered destruction of the employment force. So we are dealing with Now, before I go into what is happening, I want you guys to put yourself in a certain mindset. If I went to the doctor after living a lifetime of overeating and under-exercising, so let's say my behavior was overeating and being sedentary, what do you think would be some of the symptoms I would display or some of the diseases I would develop over time? I'd have high blood pressure, insulin resistance, high blood glucose, high cholesterol, and arterial plaquing. so that one behavior can drive a multiple series of diagnoses. So if I'm going to diagnose our civilization, I'm going to say this: the behavior we're seeing that underpins everything that's going on would be what I would call atheism or godlessness. So the further our society drifts from its roots, the Judeo-Christian roots, whether you believe in God or not, if you live as though you're in charge of what's right and wrong, you live an atheistic lifestyle. You have a godless lifestyle. This is what has underpinned everything we're seeing. This has given the power to the powers that be to do what they're doing. So one of the side effects of godlessness is a civilization in decline. There's been about 36 major world empires in the history of the world. And if you follow the arc of their rise and fall, it's remarkably similar. And moral decay is always somewhere near the end of that arc. So we also are seeing the acts of Marxism, the most atheistic political theory ever devised. It has now roots that have grown and taken advantage of our godlessness. And then finally, you take everything together, you put corporate greed and the elitist desire for control, and you have globalism, all riding on the back of the godless nature of our Western world as it is right now. Now, the very original pandemic, before COVID, happened in the garden in chapter 3 of Genesis. And that was when the serpent convinced Adam and Eve that you can be, or you shall be, as God. And that took root, developed, and is still playing its card today. This is the roots of ultimately of our godlessness. Now, what has been the side effect or the symptom of man being bitten by the notion of he can be as God? Well, what's the history of our government structure, right? It is creating seats of absolute power that people can then fill, and from this rule us as gods on earth, as gods amongst men. The pharaohs were seen as the manifestation of God's will on earth. Caesars demanded to be worshipped. The Aztec kings demanded human sacrifice to change the weather pattern. So as history repeats itself, we see that time and time again, what is the default position of governments throughout history? Absolute power, centralized power. Centralized power it's like gravity. When you cut a stem on an apple tree, the natural law of it draws it to the ground. When you have government going unaccountable long enough, it's what's called the authoritarian drift. More and more power concentrated in fewer and fewer people. This is the cycle of history. And in the last 100 or so years, we've replaced the pharaohs and the Caesars and the Genghis Khans with less fancy sounding names such as chairman, secretary, etc. But these fascists in the last 150 years have been no less power hungry than the people of old. You'd never see a break in all of history from the desire of our governments to have centralized absolute power. And seats of absolute power don't just exist in the government world. In the corporate world, we see what happens when monopolies get created, because the line of good and evil cuts through all of our hearts too. I cannot be trusted with a seat of absolute power. There should be no seat of absolute power in a church, in any institution, anywhere. Who here is familiar with this gentleman? Anybody know this guy's name? This is Martin Shkreli, also known as Farmer Bro. You might have seen the documentary on him on I think it's Netflix. So he was a hedge fund manager who got absolute control of the drug Daraprim, which is it was on the WHO's, the World Health Organization's essential medicines list, because it's one of the most powerful anti-malarial drugs and anti-parasitical drugs. Now, when he got a hold of it, it was on the market for $13.50 per pill US. He got full monopoly, full wholesale control of it. He bumped the price up to $750 per pill. Now, was Martin Shkreli thinking of the kids in Africa when he did that? No, he was thinking of saving his hedge fund, right? This is what happens when anybody has absolute control. This is a map of Europe. Now, what happened here between 1500 and 1917 has literally shaped the entire planet. And it's just a tale of two civilizations. All of Europe broke up into an East and Western world. The Eastern world went to both of these places. If you were a peasant in 1500s, whether you were in France or Russia, your lifestyle would have been radically identical, basically the same. You would have been a peasant living under the nobility class. That's it. There was no middle class, as we've known it growing up. Both of these places were ruled by monarchs. In the East, they called them czars, and in the West, they called them kings and queens. Both between 1500 and 1917, the entirety of Europe shrugged off their monarchies, but they did so in radically different ways. So we're going to start by looking at how the East did it. Now, between 1721 and 1917, Russia was ruled by czars. It's called their czarist period. Now, they were mainly an agrarian society, which meant they were mainly farmers. But these farms were privately owned by families, and at that time, as oppressed as they were under the czars, they were still net exporters of wheat and grain. So that means they could feed themselves and had some left over to ship around the world and make money. And the Russian Orthodox Church was the dominant religion. So the mindset of your average peasant, farmer, or whatever, was within a Judeo-Christian framework of values. Now what happened is, during this same period of time, in the 1800s, something started to brew in the academic circle. Evil things always start brewing in the academic circles before they start to infiltrate our culture and therefore our governments. The unholy union of Hegel, Engels, and Marx was gaining ground in the academic circles of Europe around the 1800s. Now Hegel, who had nothing to do with Engels and Marx, come up with the theory. Who here has heard of the term Hegelian Dialectics? There's a few fellow nerds in here, thank you. Hegelian Dialectics essentially was the process in which, to attain truth, Hegel said you needed two opposing values coming together. So a synthesis and an antithesis, a thesis and antithesis, which would then, as they clashed, would lead to a synthesis or the truth. Now, Engels and Marx picked up on this, and they said, you know what, we like this idea, but we feel it applies to politics as well. And the way it applies to politics is when two segments of society clash until the society crashes, then a better utopia emerges. So they had to pick classes that were already opposed to each other and try and amplify the tensions and the conflict. Now, in Europe at the time, the class system was the most obvious, best oppressive system to take the oppressor, the landowners, the nobility, and to pit them against the peasant class, the hardworking, overtaxed, overregulated peasants. And over time, they started to amplify their tensions and try to lead it to a breaking point. Now, right before this breaking point, in 1905 in St. Petersburg, a priest by the name of Father Gabon led a industrial workers' protest, peaceful protest, to St. Petersburg Square, which is where Nicholas II, the Tsar at the time, was living. And instead of going out to listen to their grievance, a peaceful grievance, and these guys were not asking for overturning of the government, by the way. They weren't looking to end the system of the czars. They were asking for less regulation, better wages, and better conditions for industrial workers in city centers. That's it. They believed in the czarist system. They did not want to overthrow it, which is very much a parallel to the truckers' convoy who went to Ottawa. They weren't looking to undo Parliament. They were looking to get their charter rights given back to them. So instead of going out to meet with them, Nicholas II, that is, he sent a horsed militia out to deal with them. Does that sound familiar? Now, unfortunately for us, it didn't go the way it did for them, because this is now known as Bloody Sunday in Russia, because they were massacred by the armed militia sent by the Tsar. So in other words, their protest fell on deaf ears. Now, about 10 or so years later, in 1917, after World War I, all the conditions they were complaining about had only gotten worse. So and then there was a full-blown violent rebellion of the people, and they overthrew the czars. And in their wake, the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, took complete and total power. So this is the tale of the East. In shrugging off their monarchy, what they replaced the monarchy with, they replaced one czar with hundreds of czars in the form of bureaucrats, Communist Party leaders, etc. A few years after Vladimir Lenin led the revolution, he died, and then Joseph Stalin took over from the 1920s until his death in the 40s. Now, what underpins the basic difference? Why did the Bolshevik Revolution gain steam in the East, but never in the West? This next slide is pretty much what this entire presentation revolves around. If you get nothing else out of tonight, I want you to pay attention to the next slide. What you're going to see is the main split between East and West was the difference between an atheistic versus a theistic political theory. You've got to remember that in an atheistic framework, which is where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels worked from, is they said, this is a purposeless, accidental, chaotic world. It's not here by design. It is uncontrollable chaos. The closest thing we have in our world that resembles order is the human mind. So we must have a hive mind of elite social engineers to sort of impose an order according to their thought process to bring order to a chaotic world. You flip that around. The theistic political framework for a political theory is that no, this world is beautifully ordered by a superintelligence, and the irony is the source of chaos comes from the human mind and heart where sin resides. The exact opposite of what the atheistic political theory would teach. One of them says the human mind is the only righteous order in a chaotic world, and the other side says in a perfectly ordered world designed by God, humans bring the only form of chaos. So if human mind and heart is the source of chaos, what would happen when it replaces the mind of God over a society? It would amplify that chaos because it would have absolutely no restraint applied to it. And this next analogy is probably the simplest way I can put it. If you look at an ant colony, it works like a perfect machine. There are ants that have their own structure within the ant colony. There are worker ants, egg-laying ants, there's soldier ants, and within those subdivisions are even greater subdivisions. Some worker ants take care of the egg-laying ants, some worker ants bring the food, some of them clean the hive, the colony, etc. Which one of those ants has any clue how this thing works? Not a single one. Not a single one. There's no class of ants called the political ant to engineer this ant colony. You could even get 1,000 experts from around the world to come down and spend 4 years, the top ant experts of planet Earth, the humans, and have them make up a false or a pseudo ant colony based on their understanding of how ant colonies work, and it would still fail. So if the human mind is that impotent in running an ant colony, can you imagine the disaster when it tries to run a human civilization? God created civilization. The reason the West was radically different is it got government class out of the way and allowed the human civilization as a machine built by God to play itself out in ways that no man could ever understand, predict, or control, or sustain. Now, what happened in Stalin's Russia when he began to unleash his social engineers on his own people? Massive death and famine. Now, this is the Holodomor in Ukraine, in which 5 million Ukrainians were starved to death. Now, part of that was willful revenge by Stalin against the Ukrainians, but some of it was simply what happens when you take privately owned and run farms, the private sector, and implement them. They work in a communistic system where no one's directly benefiting from the hard work of anybody else. The inefficiencies that turned out to unleash caused a mass starvation. Now, if we go a little bit more to the east, to China, they in 1920s, they overthrew 1,000 years of dynasties. Okay, they too saw the West, Europe, overthrow their monarchs, and they said, well, we're going to do the same thing. And for about 20 years after that, warlords ruled China, but finally around the 40s, and specifically in 1949, a person named Chairman Mao formed the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And he did so in Tiananmen Square. He turns around, he has his own, and Russia sent them a whole bunch of intellectuals to help him socially engineer his country after everyone had seen what had happened in Russia. So for some reason, as is wont to happen, is you can learn history You can live through history without learning from history. Whereas I saw a meme recently, it says, imagine getting history wrong as it literally repeats itself. It's like failing an open book test, right? So Mao looks around, he looks at the West, and he says, man, they're way more industrialized than we are in France and Spain and Italy and UK and in North America. We got to catch up. But you see, what had happened in the West had happened slowly, organically over time. Somebody makes an invention that does better farm work than doing it by hand. Well, people want to buy that machinery. And then slowly the workforce and other businesses around that item start to change the nature of, but it took over 100 years to do so naturally, organically in the West. He wanted to impose it in a 5-year period he called the Great Leap Forward. He says, I know what's best for you. I will make sure we do what happened in 100 years in the West, we'll do it in 5 years here. So again, he pulled farmers away from their own farms, took away their private property rights, and put them in 10 to 20,000 farmer communes and wanted them to produce even more food, which again was not the natural order of farming. He also took farmers and unqualified people and threw them in these huge city urban centers that had been sprung up out of overnight, basically, in factories, and said, now you run those factories like they do in the West. Well, it just doesn't work that way. So instead of the Great Leap Forward, we got the Great Famine. And between 18 to 50 million Chinese people are estimated to have starved to death in a 5-year period. And that put the brakes on the Great Leap Forward, thankfully. During this period, it was a phenomenon for children to go missing because people will hunt them down for food. Okay? This is the type of unholy hell, earthly hell, that gets unleashed even with men's good intentions, perhaps. I won't put malevolence where incompetence suffices, but even with mere incompetence, you can have disastrously terrible results. So Mao, instead of saying, you know what, I just realized that Marxism doesn't work. No, he doubled down and he said, okay, now we're going to go for a different kind of social engineering. I'll call it the Cultural Revolution. Sound familiar? And in this Cultural Revolution, it was a student-led revolution, as young as elementary school kids, all the way up to the university crowd. And they were told that what was wrong with their world, the reason they were behind the West, was because of the 4 olds. Old ways, old habits, old customs, and old ideas. So books were banned, books were burned, and statues were broken down. Does that sound familiar? Right? This is an old school, what we're living through now is an old school cultural Marxist revolution. It's happened before. It's remarkably always pinned on the shoulders of young, idealistic, but naive students. Matter of fact, it's older than even communist China. Here the barbarians sacking Rome was the first thing an invading force does. It tries to erase the historical strongholds of the civilization it's trying to subjugate. Okay? Now, ironically, after Mao's death in the 80s, who here remembers this visual? Right? That's in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, the same square where Mao had erected the Communist Party itself. The students who had led the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s had realized what kind of hell they'd unleashed onto China. And they decided to protest and wanted to be free like the West. The same class of people, the students, same square that Mao had started the Chinese Communist Party in, said, listen, we want everything to be undone. And here's a perfect example. This was on the West. When the Western media was there to take pictures such as this, the Communist Party was very well behaved. Then they kicked all the Western media out and massacred, just like the Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg Square. It's extremely difficult to undo authoritarianism once it starts. That's something we need to drive into our hearts and minds and those of our children. Now, what about the West? Anybody know what this picture is? This is the Mayflower, the signing of the Mayflower Compact. So the tale of two civilizations ends with this. The Western world also broke free from its monarch, but it did so radically differently. Mainly they left. They went to the New World, here, North America. And they said, you know what, we're just going to go do something new. Now, the majority of people who immigrated to here were the Puritans and basically Judeo-Christian adventurers. Now, on their way over, a group of boats led by the Mayflower boat, on their way they just said, look, we need to come up with a sort of like mission statement of what we're doing here. And then in November 21st, 1620, they signed the Mayflower Compact, and it can still be seen to this day in Washington, D.C. And they said, essentially, we're not here to build an empire or wealth or nobility or anything else. We're here to advance the kingdom of Christ. It was a missionary journey. And from there, they landed, and they began to unleash a society that had a very, literally, I just showed you guys the ant colony example, the theistic versus atheistic political theories. What the theistic political theory had led to was this: the single greatest revolution in government the history of the world has ever seen. Lex is Latin for law, Rex is Latin for king. And what they determined, they said, the law will be king. Because in the old world, the king made law. So if the king gets up in the morning, he's a little grumpy. It doesn't matter if he has a vindictive sense of towards somebody in his court. He just has to speak, and the law is literally magically created as the king speaks. Humans made law, Rex made Lex. And they determined, and this wasn't just an overnight discovery on their part. Every single item in the Western world's political theory, starting with British common law back in 1000 AD, where they said, you know what, we need a law system that applies to everybody, the peasant and as well as the noble. And this was what you saw occurring in the Western world, was the result of a Judeo-Christian mindset as it infiltrated more and more levels of academia, culture, and government. Eventually, the Magna Carta in 1215, which gave power away from the King of England towards the landowners, and then eventually the U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, the Canadian Bill of Rights, etc. The flow of documentation supporting Lex Rex is what transformed the Western world. We said, you know what? And it's not just any old law, it's natural law. If I go to university and I go to the chemistry department, I don't want to hear the professor's opinion as to what chemical laws are. I want to know what chemical laws we've discovered in nature. And these men and women who founded our civilization said, we have determined now, not only the laws of physics and gravity, we've realized there are laws, natural laws to civilization. And those are private property, personal freedom, and free markets. Those are the holy trinity of the Western world. And no man is above another man. There will be no nobility class. There will be no aristocracy here in this new world. There will be a set of natural laws which stand in the place of God. Those are God's natural laws. And we will obey them, and no man has the power to withhold any of those natural laws to any other man. Lex was Rex in the West. A radically different social experiment. Now, basing off of that, in the Bill of Rights in Canada in 1960, look at the curious language. Can you guys see that? Is that too... do you see what I just highlighted there on the left-hand side in the yellow? That's the opening line of our Bill of Rights in Canada in 1960. The reason we acknowledge the supremacy of God, because God is the one who puts natural law into that runs civilizations. Without seeing God as the source for the civilizational laws we have, the entire thing breaks down, philosophically and logically. Because now we're back into an atheistic worldview in which man is the only source of order in the world, in a chaotic world. No, we saw a perfectly functioning natural world in which civilizational natural laws coming from God the Creator were to be our king, the Lex that was Rex. Now we emboldened with the Constitution Act of 1982, we gave the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We birthed the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And the same thing, the opening line is the exact same as in the Bill of Rights, recognizing the supremacy of God. Because from God comes natural law, which is our government. So when other Christians tell me, you know, in a time like this, when the government asks me to do such and such a thing, and when I have to use Romans 13, you guys are familiar with Romans 13? The battle cry of most of the Christians I know that follow the government every step of the way in the last 2 years, which says you must obey your government. Now here's a problem with that statement. What is our government in the West? Is it a group of politicians? No, it's the Charter. I am continuing to obey the Charter to this day. Romans 13 should apply to the politicians asking us to disobey the charter. They're the ones under the purview of Romans 13. So I will continue to be a Romans 13 abiding, charter obeying Christian and citizen, whether or not my elected politicians choose to be lawless or lawful. And that is my answer to that. Now, another set of laws that exist in our country, this is based off the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code is what we used to put Nazi doctors to death after World War II. We said, you violated what we're going to now call the Nuremberg Code. And so when we go back home, we're going to create our own. All Western countries decided we're going to make our own Nuremberg Code. We called it the Informed Consent Laws. Now, these laws are such that I must be informed before any procedure is done to me. And that, in my clinic, I have to have people sign informed consent forms. Those informed consent forms can be signed by somebody, and if something happens to them as a result of what happens in my clinic, I can still be found to not have given proper informed consent. If a lawyer can look at my informed consent and go, okay, there's a few things missing, you didn't properly inform the client, therefore they were not properly informed, therefore their consent is invalid that they signed. Now, imagine how much worse it is if I am informed and I do not consent, but then am forced to undergo the procedure anyhow. That is a double violation of informed consent, which is to this day is the law of our land, right? And the informed consent does not allow forced or coerced or manipulation to be used, especially when it comes to introducing something into my body. Another law that we have that's sacrosanct is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents, PIPEDA. In other words, your personal information for your medical procedures are yours and yours alone. They're to be discussed between you and your doctor and no one else. So the publication of someone's personal information, personal medical information, is illegal. It is illegal. Think of how many laws are being violated currently by our government. They cannot simply choose, because of their personal interests, to take away laws that are on the books right this second. There's still a law on the books right now. And just to reiterate, private property, free markets, and personal liberty are considered by the Western founders to be a natural law, like gravity, chemistry, etc. You can violate them. I can try and violate the laws of physics by stepping into oncoming traffic, but I will always pay a price. When a society ignores these, the misery index goes way up. These, anybody know who these gentlemen are? These are the cultural Marxists that unfortunately didn't leave the West alone. In the 50s, Marxists decided to come to America. And they looked around and they said, you know what? Back in Russia, we used the oppressed versus the landowners to create tension and then to break the society down. But in post-World War II America, there was so much upwards mobility in the middle class. The middle class was literally created in the United States in the 1900s. Never in history had the average common person had access to so much upwards mobility in their properties and in their income. So the class tensions were at an all-time low in all of human history. So they said, you know what, we need, and this is all in their letters they wrote to each other. They said, listen, we're going to have to find a class of people within this society that are oppressed, but it won't be along financial lines. So who did they choose? Who did they find to create that opposite force to begin to clash North America until it crashed? The black community and the LGBT community. This is in the 50s in pre-civil rights era America, where the black community had legitimate grievances. So they got a hold, the Marxists got a hold of them. If you look at the literature surrounding the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s, and to this day in the BLM organization, have always used Marxist talking points. This goes way back to the introduction of Marxism in America. So the LGBT community was highly marginalized in that time period as well. So it was easy to get them to say, well, that's the status quo. We're not accepted in this society, so we're going to join the fight. And to this day, as a matter of fact, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, specifically said right on camera, we are trained Marxists. And before they got rid of it, their actual website had all the Marxist talking points, including the destruction of the nuclear family. Marxists have always gone after every item of the status quo. That means gender theory, sexual morality. They're trying to destroy every single pillar of the society they're invading. It's always been that way since the 1800s. So isn't it curious that this is something that doesn't date back to 2020? This goes back to the 1950s. You can follow the bouncing ball of the literature and the history. Now, what do you see? Why do you think that it used to be that we had a gay pride parade? That was it. Then it became Pride Week. Then all of a sudden, I don't remember exactly when, but we got Pride Month. All of June is Pride Month, and the first week of July is Pride Week. At the end of that week is the Pride Parade. Now, when I was at Mount Washington a couple weeks ago, there was a whole, I don't even know what it was, but these flags were flying all over the mountain. So now it's extended even beyond that. So why is it eating up more and more of our calendar space? Because this is, right there, you see, by the way, the white, pink, and baby blue triangles is the transgender community's colors. Then you have the BIPOC, Black Indigenous People of Color stripes, the brown and black, and then the LGBT flag right in the background. This is the original class, marginalized class in the 50s, picked up by the cultural Marxists to go against the status quo. They're going to keep growing that calendar more and more. I mean, at any given day in a public school, the SOGI program can be implemented, in which gender fluidity is introduced. It can be introduced in math class. It can be introduced it's like the purveying background theory in public schools. They're seeking to absolutely, and we've now seen 2 full generations that from K through 12 through university have been brought through a socialistic public school system that questions every single aspect of our status quo. And what's interesting is, if you look at, well, check this out. Have any of the norms in our society not been slowly overtaken by this agenda? Right? Sexual morality. What is gender? What is normal? A top left hand of the corner is have you guys heard of the drag queen story hour phenomenon in schools? Basically, it's big in the States, bigger than here, but basically public schools once or twice a year go to the public library where a drag queen or a series of drag queens basically read stories about transgenderism to kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. It's seeking to introduce to them a completely new concept of absolutely every aspect of society, including gender. You want to know who's anti-nature? If the West was right about natural laws being such as they are, then any countering theory to the West has to be unnatural or untrue by definition. And I submit to you that the Western world is still, to this day, in its broken form, is still the #1 immigration destination on earth. Okay? No, men, women, and LGBT people are safer nowhere than the Western world. Go to Saudi Arabia with your transgender parade. Go to China with the same thing. You are safer in the West, no matter which marginalized community you are, than anywhere else on planet Earth. It created the middle class. It created the women's rights. It's the first civilization to end slavery against its own interests, etc. And at night, when the sun goes dark on the opposite side of the Earth, and you look at the Earth via satellite, where are all the lights? The whole Western world lights up. It's as if God made it as obvious as possible who's doing well and who isn't. Even North and South Korea, which was the same culture and community 50, 60 years ago, at night you can see South Korea completely lit up and North Korea is completely in the dark. It's quite a nice metaphor. So, we've covered atheism. We've covered the fact that we have a decline in our society, which is typical of any great society. We're in the middle of a decline. And that Marxism has been the driving force of this split and taking advantage of our godlessness. So the very last thing I want to talk about before Q&A will be globalism. Now, the United Nations was established in after World War II. Let's find my notes here. I've been skipping my notes this whole time. So on October 24th, 1945, we saw the establishment of the United Nations. And it was an attempt to bring a harmonized cooperation between Earth's nations. Now, over the years, I think we've all noticed that there's been a gradual, continual left-leaning drift in the UN. And every talking point you hear in a socialist university is being parroted. Culture has finally penetrated government. Government tends to be downstream from culture. Culture itself is downstream from the academic circles. And this is why oftentimes, almost exclusively in the last 200 years, it starts with university professors and then it ends up in a legislature's hand. Now, in 2019, the UN and a series of corporations got together and they held an event called Event 201. Anybody else has heard of that? And in Event 201, they said, look, we've had about 200 pandemics in the history of the world that we know of. We're about, sooner or later, we'll get that 201st pandemic, Event 201. We got to prepare for that. And the best way to prepare for it is to make sure that the most powerful governments, the G8 countries, the top 8 economies on Earth, and the largest corporations work together in order to come up with a solution for this 201st pandemic. Well, about 6 months later, long and behold, the 201st pandemic hit. Now, it could have been coincidence that this happened this way, but they put into action exactly what they had talked about in 2019, which was an unprecedented amount of cooperation between governments and corporations, in this case especially Big Pharma. And then they implemented rules, lockdowns, regulations, and interventions that had never been done before. So they had gosh darn it, got together right in time to plan exactly what was going to happen in 6 months. So now during this lockdown, payout for people who aren't going to work, etc., we saw a peculiar shift. Now this graph is from the World Economic Forum itself. What you see in the stubbier, darker green graphs is in each of these countries listed. Can you guys see that somewhat? The green stubby graphs, thicker graphs, is the total wealth of billionaires in each of those countries in 2009. And the long, thin graph is the total cumulative wealth of billionaires by 2020. The only class to do well during the lockdowns was the billionaire class. Anybody here, when you couldn't go to a mom and pop shop, where could you still go? Costco, you could still order stuff on Amazon, etc. The wealth was transferred to small and medium-sized businesses, all into the hands of corporate giants. So who do you think donates the most money? Who do you think has the ability to pay more money into our political class? The average mom and pop shop or the corporate giants, right? There is an unholy union throughout history of money and power. Power wants money, money wants power. Now, do I have to introduce this gentleman, or is he well? Have you guys seen the pictures of him in his leather Star Trek outfit? I'm like, I had to double check to make sure it was real, but this guy looks, sounds, and acts like a Bond villain, and he dresses like a Cobra Commander. So he founded the World Economic Forum in 1971, Klaus Schwab, and ever since then they meet once a year in Davos, Switzerland, and it's the highest levels of power meeting the highest levels of money. Usually not good for me and you, okay? Especially as it gets good to them and they think, well, you know what, we really got to get busy here. We need an event to take care. Now, one thing they have is a program called the Young Global Leaders Program. And since about the 80s, Klaus Schwab has reached out to young upstart politicians around the world and asked them to join his Young Global Leaders Program. Now, whether or not, I don't care, I don't know what goes on behind closed doors at the World Economic Forum. I don't have to know. Because at the very least, when you have a shared ideology, you will have, and you get together to talk about it. I'm not saying he's pulling strings and he's got blackmails on, he's blackmailing every single he doesn't need any of that. We're seeing evidence of them attending the same church, basically. Whether you're in this church or another Bible-preaching church in Coquitlam, you'll see Christians acting similarly because of our shared ideology. It doesn't have to be centrally controlled. So whether or not there's central control coming out of the WEF or there's just shared ideology, it doesn't matter. I care more about the ideology than anything else. So The first graduate of his Young Global Leaders program was in 1992 was Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany today. And she has been an absolute forerunner of every single globalist agenda you can imagine, including open borders. The open border concept comes directly from our elites. And what do you think is the net effect of having open borders? And what tends to happen with those open borders, by the way? It tends to be filled with people from another country on the other side of the planet that have the least Judeo-Christian value system imaginable. I see it as an attempt, and this is my guess, my opinion, to another way to wash out the Judeo-Christian roots of the West. What better way than to dilute the thought life of your populace than to flood it with non-Christian thinking cultures, no matter what their ethnicity is. Now, unfortunately for us, another graduate of the Young Global Leaders program is both Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Friedland. Chrystia Friedland, by the way, was one of the biographers for George Soros, and she's been in a governing role with the WEF for over 15 years. So again, shared ideology. What do they believe? Because they all share that belief, which will drive their continuous synchronized action. Klaus Schwab just happened to write a book in 2020 called COVID-19, The Great Reset, in which he literally says, we need to use the we need to use the COVID-19 phenomenon to jumpstart the Great Reset. And what exactly does the Great Reset have in mind? Well, they again made it easy for us. Not only did they write a book about it, they made a commercial about it. So let's watch the commercial. And this is from 2015, by the way. Sorry. All right, so I want to go through those 8 points real quick. Number one, end of private property. Oh, fantastic. That's one of the holy trinity concepts of the Western world. When you don't own something, when you have to rent your house, your car, from the government, guess who has total control? We're back to centralized power, which is the antithesis of the West. No bueno. Oh my gosh, my notes are all messed up here. Here it is. And then it said the U.S. will no longer be the leading community on earth. Why would they target the U.S. specifically? Because it is the forerunner, the most successful example of Lex Rex, right? They want to undo Lex Rex. So they're hoping and conniving to ending the U.S.'s ability to have. And when you weaken an economy enough, you lose a country's power. This is the goal undermining the politicians, even within the U.S., that are making every single decision as though they were absolutely thirsting for the destruction of the economy, is a direct result of this ideology. The idea of organ creation, printed up, you can print up your own kidneys, that could just be a pie-in-the-sky science fiction type of hope on their part, but does it not remind you of the kind of great leap forward thinking that Mao, for example, had? When men have even good intentions, but they get ahead of God himself, disaster happens. Imagine if you're told, you know what, you can't get a kidney. You're going to have to use one of the 3D printed ones because we're trying to do a great leap forward in medical technology. How many people are going to die from that? Forced guinea pig medical experiments. I don't know. Number 4, you will eat no meat. And they don't say it in this commercial, but they have you got to eat something. We can't all be vegan. Well, they're thinking of creating mass-scale insect food production. I am not joking. We'll be eating bugs, according to them. That, not only is that bad enough on its own, but just like with the Stalin's communal farming and Mao's Great Leap Forward, what if not only do we have to eat bugs, but they can't produce enough bugs for us to eat? You know what I'm saying? It could be worse than not eating bugs. Number 5, basically an excuse for loose borders and the dilution of Western values. They say we're going to have to be more comfortable with letting people into our countries from other countries. You're just going to have to get used to it. Open borders. Number 6, carbon tax. When you start to, as we're seeing now, when you make cheap energy expensive, who suffers? You think Leonardo DiCaprio cares whether it's $5, $6, $10, $12, $15 a liter or a gallon? The millionaire, billionaire class does not even smell the kind of changes we get crippled by when you make cheap energy sources expensive. It's a way to cripple the middle class. The middle class, if you haven't noticed, is the number one thing standing in the way of a ruling class. Because who is harder to rule than people who don't need you to rule? The middle class is financially independent, intellectually independent. They're notoriously hard to rule because they see you as a government worker to be a nuisance, which is exactly what they are. I call it the parasitical class. You have a class of some of the most mediocre minds imaginable, okay? Say what you want about Justin Trudeau. I don't know him personally, but I don't think this man is a champion of intellectual achievement. He's a trust fund baby, growing up in absolute wealth. He said during his 2015 run for the prime ministership, he literally said, and this scared me as a small business owner, he said, most small businesses are a way for rich people to hide their money. And I'm saying he comes from a world in which there's some truth to that, because he comes from elite financial circles in which, yeah, you have a minority of businesses that are bought and purchased by wealthy people to have the loss of that business work against their income to try and sneak under a tax bracket, which will save them money. But that is not the average business or small business. This is what people live and die off. Okay, that is over 95% of small businesses are livelihoods for people like me and you. But this is where his mind is at. Okay, he does not understand the real world. Anyhow, number 7, the Mars mission. Again, I don't know what to make of that. Number 8, very telling. The Western values have been tested to the breaking point. Are you kidding me? We've already tested Western values, and it gave us the most successful, freest, most profitable civilization in history. What they're saying is we're going to do away with Western values. And as they pull Western values away from us, we begin to fail. And basically what this should say is once we've pulled enough Western values out from your society, it'll collapse. And then we'll have a whole new world, a great reset. What Klaus Schwab calls the 4th industrial revolution, which will not be an organic, the printing press was invented. That naturally changed the way communications went. And then people came up with the combustible engine. These types of industrial revolutions happen normally, organically, and they benefit everybody. This new type of industrial revolution will be the exact opposite. It'll be the imprisoning of people against their will. Almost done here, folks. A little bit about COVID. By the way, 2 weeks from now, we're going to do a talk here, same place, same time, just on the science behind COVID. Okay, so if you're interested, come on back. But just to spend a couple slides on it. This is the CDC stats for COVID deaths in the US. Now, as you can see, on the very right-hand side of your screen, there's been a total of about 921,000 deaths. And there's the conservative estimate of how many cases there have been is 147 million on the left-hand side of your screen. Now, they've also admitted that 75% of the deaths on the right-hand side, the 921, had an average of more than 3 comorbidities. In other words, it wasn't the healthy that were dying. 3/4 of the dead were already quite unhealthy. This gives you, by the way, a 99.4 survival rate if you contract the Chinese coronavirus. Now, this is not accounting for a young person that's fit. This is grouping everyone together, including the very obese, very sick, and very old. So if you go by category, which they do on their website, a under 17-year-old class of people have 3 times higher chance of dying from the flu than COVID. And not a single child under 18 died of COVID that wasn't already gravely ill. Okay, we're talking about ones in hundreds of thousands in those age groups. These are actual statistical data found on the CDC website. And Bonnie Henry, after the truck convoy picked up speed, admitted that on the BC COVID dashboard, which I followed throughout the last 2 years, it listed all the total hospitalizations in BC since the start of the pandemic. She admitted about a month ago that 45% of those were people that had tested for COVID once they got to the hospital and were not there because of COVID. That means half the hospitalizations are not really COVID hospitalizations, if she's telling us the truth. Okay? Now, here's an interesting phenomenon. This right here is from Google. This is not a right-wing website. This is directly from Google. You type in Canada, COVID, right into Google, and this map is the first thing that pops up. Now, look at the lower parts of our caseload. And by the way, you can see right there, we've had a total of 37,000 deaths in a country of about 37 million people since the pandemic started. Now, if I look, this was last week, March 21st, the lowest part of the line last week represents 8,153 new cases that day. Okay? Remember that number. 37 million people in Canada, 8,000 cases a day at best. This is the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, which has over 200 million people. They've had 23,000 deaths, kind of strange, and the lowest part of their graph is 334. That is literally 10 times less, more than 10 times less, what we get in a day. So what's going on? Well, let's look a little further. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has about 90 million people, and they've had 1,300 deaths, and that low part of their graph represents 35 cases a day. And finally, Nigeria, 204 million people, I think, in Nigeria, 3,000 deaths, 10 times less than us, although they have 5 times the population, and their low point is 0. That's a 0 there. What is going on? I'll factor in, okay, I'll say, look, some of these places don't have the same high-tech communications and societies that we have, so maybe there's some underreporting. Okay, fine. And yes, they have less obesity than we do and warmer weather. Okay, let's factor that in. But does that account for absolutely everything there? I beg to differ. I cannot see that. Now, Nigeria and the Congo are some of the hottest malaria epicenters on Earth. They have a combined between Nigeria and the Congo, I think they have something like a quarter of the Earth's malaria cases every year. So what do? What's a great combatant to something like a parasite, an anti-parasitical drug? They've rendered hydroxychloroquine cheaper than our vitamin C. So the majority of their population takes it every morning like we take vitamins. And Nigeria has basically alluded to the fact that, yes, it has had a positive impact, and they were pressured by the WHO at a certain point to get rid of using hydroxychloroquine for COVID, and they said, no, we're not doing that. India's Uttar Pradesh, the first graph I showed you, they released information that they were using ivermectin. Anybody who tested positive for COVID was sent home with an ivermectin kit. In BC, both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are illegal to use for COVID. What in the world? What is the reasoning behind that? Those drugs have been around for so long, over 5 decades. They've been around so long that their safety rating is so high that you don't even need a license to produce it. You need to be a pharmaceutical company, but it's a generic, non-patented drug, which means there's no money in it, right? It's a cheap, natural cure. What was I going to say? Oh, it'll come back to me later. Now, to move off of COVID and to hit the final stretch here, what's another marker of a regime that's on the decline? It's a deceptive media, okay? So when the trucker convoy began, the CBC literally said they were protesting dangerous road conditions. They later retracted that and says, well, there was a bilateral protest that started around the same time. One of them was for road conditions. One of them was for the convoy, okay. But that's not, they know the impression they give when they put out a headline. Literally 98% of people, there was a Harvard study that proved this, only read headlines when it comes to their personal research. And it's usually on social media. So they know how the game works, right? Trudeau called us called the trucker convoy a small fringe minority who have unacceptable views, which is ironic considering his views are the unacceptable ones. And what's interesting too is when he had his Emergency Act come up for a vote in Parliament 3 or 4 weeks ago, whenever that was, at first there were some NDPs that were going to go against the Emergency Act. There were some Liberal Party members that were going to go against the Emergency Act. And then he comes out and says, this is not going to be a vote just on the Emergency Act. This will be a non-confidence vote. Now, what that means is if they vote against him and the act does not go through, it triggers a general election. And in one fell swoop, every single person except for the Conservative Party and some of the Bloc Québécois went right lockstep and barrel with Trudeau. Why is that? They were afraid to face the general population in a general election. In other words, I don't believe they believe we're a fringe minority. Okay? They see the satellite footage from CSIS on how big the convoys were and how many of them there were. They see the transactions of how many people donated to the convoy. They were afraid to face the general public in a general election. That's very, very telling. You heard about the desecration of the statue in Ottawa by the Terry Fox statue. This was the desecration that took place, by the way. I don't know about you, but I think this is more of a desecration. This is Gassy Jack over in Gastown in Vancouver a couple weeks ago, who apparently didn't pass mustard with the cultural Marxist revolutionaries and is now no more. Remember, we were told that the war memorial was desecrated. Was desecrated in Ottawa. What really happened is somebody climbed up it and went like this. And after that, he was chastised by the own convoy members, and nobody ever touched. Not only did they not touch the war memorial, they swept the snow off of it every single day until our government put a fence around it so that snow could then accumulate. And then they took a picture of that and said, "You see the state that our war memorial is in now that these guys are in town," etc. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this is more of a desecration of a war memorial. This happened in Cranbrook, BC. Somebody spray painted over an actual war memorial. That's great. That didn't pick up much news, did it? That's a pro-vaccine person desecrating a war memorial. This gentleman is an Antifa member, a registered sex offender, and he ran over 4 protesters, peaceful protesters, at one of the convoys in, I think, Saskatchewan. That's attempted murder, as far as I'm concerned. If I plow my SUV into a crowd of people, running over 4 of them, I've committed a crime. Now, he was right out with a very low-level bail within a few days. And how long was Tamara Lynch, one of the organizers of the convoy, held with $25,000 bail? Okay? For how long? 2 or 3 weeks? And then she got let out on a supreme gag order. She cannot say anything until her court case. Who's being treated? She broke no single law. Not a single law she broke. She broke some bylaws and some mandates, but that's it. She's being treated worse than a guy who tried to kill as many protesters as he could. That's the kind, and there's crickets on CBC for that one. Speaking to the CBC, they receive over $1 billion from our government. That's a lot of money. That's the overwhelming majority of their budget. They are effectively a state-sponsored, state-owned media. They know where their bread's buttered. You think they're going to be critical of the Liberal Party, who is their biggest champion and funds them the most? No. The left wing of our aisle in politics has purchased themselves a corporate media chain. That is never a good idea. And then if that wasn't enough, another $600 million was earmarked for good journalism, as determined by the Liberal Party, because they're the ones in the majority power, and they're the ones who instituted this program. In other words, there's $600 million out in the ether waiting to come into your lap if you're a good journalist. I don't know about you, but that speaks for itself. Here's the end game, by the way. The UK finance minister has already introduced the concept of a universal digital ID. And he wants to tie it to a digital government currency. In other words, they want to do away with cash and credit cards and debit cards, and instead have a currency funneled not through central banks, not through local credit unions, through the government. Which means, as he said himself, he goes, well, now we can control, we can shut off financing for terrorism and other things like that. If someone's trying to purchase something dubious and we reckon they're terrorists, we can shut them down. They can't even buy a candy bar. And I'm thinking, well, of course they're going to say that's only for terrorists, but as we saw a couple weeks ago, it also includes if you happen to support with $40 donation the truckers convoy and you're a single mom in Chilliwack, you can get your bank account frozen with this prototype of a government-controlled economy. No thanks. To me, this is their ultimate goal. The Vax passport was just a way to try and get us all used to being totally controlled, every purchase, every sale, every trade being tracked by our government. That is my firm opinion. What's happening in China today? There's 2 more slides. They are building what's called the New Silk Road, whether it's by commercial ports in the water or train lines across Asia and Europe. They're now owning the transportation mechanism for manufactured good. They already manufacture, by the way, 80% of our pharmaceuticals and the majority of our goods. So at one point, and they're the second largest owners of U.S. debt at over $1 trillion. If they sold a quarter of their U.S. held debt, it would sink the U.S. dollar overnight. Now, why aren't they doing that yet? U.S. is still their number 1 customer. If the U.S. dollar is not worth much, they don't get paid as much. What they're in the works, what people are anticipating they're doing, because they've already started doing this, is if they start to steal intellectual property. They manufacture PlayStations, they manufacture iPhones, they know how to make all of these things. There's no international court that holds them accountable for copyright violations. If they decide to become the world's providers, not only to manufacture, but to transport, and then to make the money for the product, all from stolen intellectual property, they will no longer need the US dollar, at which point they can do whatever they want. They've already actually approached Saudi Arabia and said, you know what? We don't want to pay you in the US dollar is still the petrodollar. All countries buy oil with the US dollar. It's the world's reserve currency for now. But they are now in talks, China, with Saudi Arabia to purchase oil from the Saudis using a yuan, the Chinese dollar. That alone would greatly weaken the US dollar. And the reason Saudis are willing to go along with it is they're mad at the Biden administration for backing Iran and lifting the sanctions off Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia are mortal enemies. So who knows what's going to happen, but these are the things that are happening now. What about Russia? What's the deal with Russia and Ukraine in 90 seconds or less? First of all, I find it curious that every single person on Facebook that I can see has gone, as soon as the media said, no more COVID, all Ukraine. Everyone has a Ukraine flag on their profile. Everyone's an expert. Everyone loves the Ukraine. Zelensky's the best guy in the world. It's like a flip of a switch. This is the mind control. This is the weak-mindedness you're seeing. Now, if you see, these are all pipelines, natural gas and oil pipelines coming out of Russia. They're now one of the biggest providers of natural gas to many European countries. Okay, they've massively increased their production and delivery in the last 15 years. Now, as you can see, do you guys see the Ukraine? It's right above the black box that says Turkish Stream. That's the Ukraine right there. They are a major strategic porthole through which Russia gets its natural gas into Europe. I don't believe they want to destroy those infrastructures. I don't believe that Russia wants to completely destroy the Ukraine. The Ukraine, Putin's no good guy, don't get me wrong, okay? Putin's an ex-KGB. He's a Stalinesque style authoritarian commander. His administration's, how many political executions are they responsible for? Who knows? I'm not saying he's a good guy. But what he isn't, by the way, his number 1 sin is he's anti-globalist. He's kicked out a certain number of central banks out of Russia. He's not woke in any sense of the word. He's very politically incorrect. But mainly he stands against NATO because Zelensky, on the other side of the equation, is someone who is cozying up to NATO, which is the agreement that Russia had with Ukraine, is that NATO would not get in between the two of them. That's probably the main. I have no idea what's really going on, by the way. But it's a lot more complicated. The Transparency Project is a think tank that in 2019 listed the two most corrupt countries in Europe. Number one was Russia. Number two was the Ukraine. We're not dealing with good guys here. Do you guys know what NGOs are? Non-governmental organizations. They're basically entities that are perfectly designed to transfer money from corporations to politicians' hands. Okay? Ukraine is basically a whorehouse for worldwide NGOs. Okay? There is massive corruption. Zelensky, the picture you saw in his tactical gear where he says, "I need an ammo, not a ride." First of all, those were 2 years old. Those were not recent. When he took a picture of himself recently in a hospital, supposedly visiting the wounded, somebody noticed in the background the hospital outlets were three-pronged, which is a class of electrical system that does not exist in the Ukraine. Is he even in the Ukraine? His administration had said that a Jewish cemetery had been bombed by the Russians. An actual journalist actually went to that cemetery, took actual pictures. There was absolutely no sign of anything. What's going on? I don't know. Putin's a bad guy. Zelensky's a puppet. You guys know what the Pandora Papers are? Right? Somebody unleashed 12 million files showing the offshore dealings of 35 major world leaders, including Zelensky. These guys who make $100 and some odd thousand a year Zelensky has a $35 million mansion in Miami. He owns parts of corporate television stations around the world. He has an investment portfolio that would make Warren Buffett blush. Okay, these people are in the midst of a nexus in which power gets money from corporations, corporations buy power from the elites. This is something's going on, but they couldn't care less about. The real victims in the Ukraine are the innocent women and children. That is a fact, because there is an act of war going on over there. But the transparency is not very high. Okay? There's some sort of thing. It isn't for the good of the average person. This is a power-playing war between the elites that couldn't care less about us. To them, we're ants. We're useless. So, yes, there it is. The Guardian even talked about the offshore wealth of... and Hunter Biden, he got a job with a Ukrainian, this is a couple of years ago, he was found to have a job with a Ukrainian oil and gas company, making something like 80 grand a month. He doesn't speak Ukrainian. He's a lawyer by trade or by education. He doesn't know anything about oil and gas. And his dad just happened to be the vice president of the United States at the time. So maybe there's a link there. I don't know. I can't prove it. That it doesn't pass the smell test. So to sum up the entire presentation in one concept. Throughout history, elites have ruled over the plebes. We're the plebes. And we got a respite for about 200 years here in the West. So we don't really have a concept of how naturally things are for most people throughout most of history. But right now what you're seeing is the elite class trying to once again subvert the middle class into the plebe class. That's what you're seeing. That's what's going on. And if you look at it through that lens, everything that's being said and done makes perfect sense. Because when they destroy the value of your dollar, your hard-earned dollar, the rich class doesn't keep liquid cash around like the middle class and the lower classes does. You don't necessarily have real estate money in the bank. You've got your savings in the bank. The more they print money and the more they inflate that money, the more your past labor is worth less and less. It's like taxing you in the past. But these guys hold hard assets. If you own real estate, all that inflation does is it makes your property worth more. Hard assets like precious metals and real estate don't lose value, no matter what happens to the worth of the fiat currency. But if you only hold liquid cash like savings, which is the majority of middle class and lower class people, you're losing your savings. Okay? They're untouched by it. You are. And what they want to do, my opinion, is drive the fiat currency over the edge to worthlessness and reintroduce a new world reserve currency, which will be a digital type, crypto type currency that they have complete control over. Interestingly enough, if you're up on your Revelation, there's tremendous parallels between what's happening in the world today and what Revelation says the end times will look like. So I'll invite you to. We're doing a series in Revelation here on Sundays, so come join us tomorrow for an insight as to that. What do? We speak the truth courageously, consistently, lovingly. Non-compliance, which I think is a bad way to look at it. We're complying with the charter. Our government is not. So keep complying with the charter, let them do what they will. And to get right with God. We're a first world that may start having third world problems soon. That's not what I want to hand my children. I want to fight. I want things to get straightened out. But my power is going to have to come from above if we're going to succeed. We have to cry out to God for mercy in this civilization. We've done a lot of sin in our civilization. We're not guiltless. But we cannot just fight this with truth and strategy and etc. We absolutely need God's help. He is the only true person worthy of having centralized power, right? And as Christians, we are waiting for the return of our King, which we don't know when that's going to happen necessarily. But getting right with God is especially important. So 2 weeks from now, we're going to do a purely science-based review of COVID, vaccines, everything involved with on a purely scientific basis. And that concludes our talk today, and we're just going to open up to questions. You can leave if you want, or you can stay behind. I'm going to stay as long as you guys want me to, and we're going to do some question and answer. So thank you for coming. Can I get a volunteer to be my Vanna White? Definitely not. No.
How does the mark on the right hand and the forehead coincide with cryptocurrency then? If you say that's the coming type of money, and I have no idea even what cryptocurrency is. It was sort of unattainable, I thought, because it's expensive money. But I know nothing about it. But I'm curious to know, because it says, you know, let them be wise in Revelation, that they'll put a mark on your right hand or forehead. It'll calculate to the number 666. So it's not necessarily 666. It's
Correct.
something that calculates to that.
Yep.
And people are thinking that it's the vax and what they're injecting us with, but they're putting it here on our shoulders. So there's nothing to do really with the right hand and the forehead.
Yeah, no, the vaccine is not the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast will be something that will be so obviously tied into worshiping the beast that kind of like when Roman soldiers used to carry a statue of Caesar around the empire, and they would say, bow to Caesar, you know, pay homage to Caesar and worship him as Lord, and Christians would say, I can't. And they would sometimes be killed right on the spot or imprisoned or whatever. The mark of the beast will be something, it'll be tied into a cryptocurrency or whatever form of currency will exist at the time, in the sense that it will be a debit card that you can't buy anything. There'll be no more cash, I think is the implication. And we see that our cashless society is pretty much this close to being here. You will need it to purchase anything. And it will be most likely a subdermal, you know, chip or something that will be, and remember the word forearm is the only word in Greek for this whole part of the arm. So it can be anywhere along here according to Revelation. Wrist, thumb, here, or there, or the forehead. Which again makes sense. If I can just walk out of a store holding my groceries and it scans my head and the door is either locked or open, it will be that though. And it will not be something sneaky like the vaccine is now. It will be obvious and you will be without excuse because it'll be an act of worship to the beast that no one can deny. They won't sneak it in and go, I just got you to take the mark of the beast. Right? Yeah, it's not the vaccine. It's not the vaccine.
First of all, I want to say thank you for an informative and educational, scary presentation, but we're most all aware of. But my question is this. What can we do, if there is, that we can really stop our Canadian government this year? Anything?
I don't know, because we're not going to face them in an election this year, right? right now I think the only thing we can do is we comply with the charter. We don't bend the knee to what they want us to do. And honestly, this year, I could not answer that. I don't know, because we're not facing them in a general election, right? But we have to, I think this year, the only thing you can do on a financial level, I'm moving all my money out of liquid assets and purchasing hard assets. If you don't have real estate type of money, you can buy, I'm buying a lot of crypto. I do believe in Bitcoin. I do believe in owning and holding your own precious metals. Gold and silver will not lose value, but the value of our dollar is literally like a melting block of ice. So any liquid cash sitting in your bank account is like a block of ice out of your fridge. It's just melting slowly but surely. Whereas buying precious metals is like putting it back in the freezer. It won't grow, it won't shrink. And then we continue to educate ourselves and tell all of our friends and family these types of things. We got to get educated first, and we got to pass that education onwards for this year. Sorry, it's the best I can do.
There is a provincial election recall being organized.
Okay. Let's hope.
Thank you, sir. So the legacy media seems to have bought into all this pretty good. So it's hard to find truth in that. And that was one of your first slides, I think, was what is truth.
Mm-hmm.
But I also found during the trucker convoy that places like True North and some of these other ones weren't necessarily asking very hard questions either.
Yep.
So do you have some good media or news sources that, seem to be robust?
I mean, you'd have to I fracture my attention over I watch legacy media as well, usually to know it probably is the exact opposite of the truth, most likely. But it's good to know what the state's saying. I follow a handful of guys, both in Canada. I mean, Rebel News and True North are the only real conservative outlets that are not corporately owned. In the States, there's a podcast by a guy called Charlie Kirk that I like to listen, because these guys interview people who know stuff, who are in politics, in business, in the military. They don't just pontificate. They have access to people. Glenn Beck's pretty good. He's got a lot of access to a lot of people. Dan Bongino, he's got a show on Fox News, but he's primarily got his own podcast. He's an ex-Secret Service. He protected Obama, for example. Ex-New York City cop, ex-Secret Service. And he's pretty good. Again, he has a lot of access to a lot of people he can interview. I listen to I have a subscription to the Daily Wire. They got a pretty good array of people on there. So they're the alternative media for us that are not bought and paid for by the state has to be something we get familiar with. They're good. I mean, they're basically like a newspaper version of the Rebel News, right? Like, they'll at least give you a countering point of view. You can detect their own biases, like you're doing when you watch them interview the convoy. I mean, there were some people involved with the convoy that I don't necessarily agree with. But I mean, for crying out loud, if the litmus test for a movement is that it has absolute purity, well, what do you make of the BLM movement in the States and the Antifa protests that literally, does anybody here even know about what happened in Seattle during the December 2020? The Chaz Chop region? Put up your hand if you've even heard of that. Yeah, okay, well, in this room, it's going to be something. You have no idea how many of my liberal friends and family have never heard of the Chaz Chop phenomenon, where literally Antifa and BLM protesters kidnapped a 6-square city block in Seattle and just took it over. It was their autonomous zone. They call it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, Chaz. That's terrorism, right? The people I listened to actually sent interviewers sneaking into this place, interviewing the residents who had to be interviewed with like the black face and the treasure that an FBI person in the FBI Witness Protection Program has to use. Because they said, if I'm found to talk to you guys, they're going to come in here, beat me up, burn my house down. Literal terrorism was happening just a few miles from here. No one even talked about it. I don't know if there's a single arrest made with the people who coordinated that, right? So you have to fracture over the antithesis of the state-run media. People who don't have are not making money from parroting the party line.
Hey, I liked your bit on the history stuff. In regards to sort of the elite and the plebes, there hasn't really ever been a middle class before. And I don't think they've taken that into account. So as a middle class, this is a new thing in history. This is not in their playbooks. They don't know what to do, and I think that's why they're messing up a lot. My question was, yeah, like, what advantages do we have as the middle class, and what is the sort of plays we have, our advantages, and how do we obey God, and how do we let God and His power shine through and just overcome them?
Yep, that's a great question. We have all the power. That's the sad state of it. If remember the Revolutionary War in the States, England, the Puritans left Europe to escape their government. The government followed them here and wanted to. England's the one who brought slavery back here, by the way. And the founding fathers lamented to each other in their writings, like, they're bringing the old world sins to the new world. 3% of colonialists picked up weapons against England, the most powerful army at the time. 3%. You don't need a majority. And I think my estimate is that at least 30% of the population right now sees things the way we do, about a third. The middle third, which is mostly apathy driving their apathy, are starting to wake up. We got to keep telling people these kinds of things. We can't shy away from getting into uncomfortable conversations. Now, don't necessarily do it at work where you might get fired, but in your personal circles, right? Because if 40% of us, or even 30% of us, had actively, completely, if 30% of churches had just left their doors open the whole time, I don't think they would have. What was the actual number of churches who left their doors open? I can think of 2 in Victoria, and I don't know of anything outside of Victoria, but I'm sure there, but I'm talking about the high minority of churches fought against the system. So we need to pray that God would awaken that middle third. We have all the power. Imagine if all the middle class says, you know what? I ain't ever wearing a mask again. I ain't ever taking another experimental medication. And I am not going to implement any of these mandates to any of my customers, friends, or family. It would be dead in a second. We have all the power. So we need to pray that God wakes that middle third up. You look what happened in the States, in Virginia, in that one Luton County in Virginia, where there's a school board. School boards in the States hold public hearings like a town hall meeting with the parents all the time. Virginia is historically an incredibly left-leaning state. In one election cycle, it kicked out all the educational leaders and the governor, the left-leaning governor, and the attorney general in one election cycle because of what parents saw was being taught to their kids in terms of radical sexual ideology, the sexualization of their children. We need to pray that people wake up to that. They've overplayed their hand in many ways. And my question is the middle third, how much is it going to take for the middle third to finally go, okay, enough is enough? So we need to keep preaching the truth. We need to get on our knees and beg God to have mercy on us. And we need to live in compliance with the charter. That's all. That's the only thing we can do.
So, you were mentioning about, you said some people can go through history and learn nothing from history,
Yep.
right? And because I grew up under martial law before I immigrated here, so we were under a dictatorship, and in the end,
Where was this?
back in the Philippines, and then I was in the 1986 revolution. I had just graduated from college at the time, and so people in my generation were we went through that, and we had friends and relatives who were killed by Marcos and his cronies. Okay, and that revolution, we occupied the highway, the main highway there, for 3 days. And the only reason why Marcos left was because he's Reagan's golfing buddy, and Reagan got this helicopter and got them all into the Guam Air Force Base, and that's how they escaped. But yeah, if not, you know, but people of all political spectrums were there, and so it wasn't anything about political parties. Everyone just wanted him out, it really floors me that the Filipinos here, in my generation especially, most of them, I'd say, I'm probably maybe, there are 2 others I know from my ethnic community that are against the mandates, and everybody falls for it. And it just floors me that haven't these people learned? I mean, we all went through, like, we know what it's like, and they didn't see the signs coming. Like, I saw the signs coming from 2020 already, like the first few months, when I saw that the homeless people weren't dying. Like, they should have been wiped out from the first variant of COVID, when COVID first came out, and I started to question it already. If it was as deadly as it was supposed to be, why weren't, you know, why wasn't it affecting the homeless, who weren't, you know, washing their hands for 20 seconds or wearing masks or social distancing? But anyway, and then you're saying that. Now, in the Philippines right now, the younger generation, there's this education campaign going on now, and a lot of the young people are being told that those years were the best years in the Philippines, you know, in so many levels, culturally.
You mean through their education systems teaching them that?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, they don't teach it. That's what I heard. They're not teaching it. You know, those years, like that, like just the generation before them, and the things. But
No,
there's
sorry,
also the
just for the sake of time and everybody else.
Oh,
you have
sorry.
A specific
Okay,
question.
so now, when you mentioned that, I was thinking, could the difference be because here, and maybe also there, but here in the West, there's that phenomenon that they call the mass formation psychosis, and I'm sure you've heard of that.
Yeah.
Could that be the difference, the reason why people are not learning from history, even though they've gone through it?
Yeah, I mean, the mass formation psychosis it would be a different phenomenon than how we got to this point right here. The reason that people are falling for it is because in the last 2 full generations, the Zoomers and the Millennials, I'm 47 years old. When I was going through elementary and high school and even college, woke culture was really, like, I just started seeing it at the tail end of my university years. These people have been brought up in woke culture, pro-socialist education system, basically cultural Marxism. They wanted to take over the institutions in the 50s. They said we got to slowly put more and more teachers that are like us, Marxists, and eventually we'll educate more and more of the population. And eventually, because who comes out of university? Future politicians, future lawmakers, cultural leaders. That's how we got to this point. Now, they used the fear of the propaganda machine, because all of a sudden you had every major media outlet in the world parroting the same phrase. That was one of my first clues as to something was wrong, is that it was too synchronized. You could tell there was way too much synchronicity between all the governments and all the medias. And they got everyone so afraid to die of COVID. We got what Malone was on the Joe Rogan podcast was calling the mass formation psychosis. You have to have a fear flashpoint to have that fear psychosis triggered. But we've abandoned God. You guys have heard of the Gulag Archipelago? Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was behind the lines. He was in the gulags, and he escaped, and he became one of the first prophets before it was cool to be anti-Soviet, which pretty much was after the Iron Curtain fell in 1989. But he came and he was lecturing in the 70s and 80s in the U.S. saying, You don't want to go because just like right now, there's so many left-leaning academics who are pro all of this. There was a huge element of the American society that wanted to be friendly with the Russians. He came and he says, if I look at I've looked at the entire history of my country from the time we were an Orthodox Russian country, conservative, to our fall into communism. And he goes, if I can sum it up in one sentence, we have forgotten God. So what have we done in the West in the last 150, 60 years? We have forgotten God. Our education system reflects it. The vacuum we've left behind. Why do you think that there was such a cult around people like Bonnie Henry or Anthony Fauci? When you remove religion from an average person's life, you don't remove the need for religion. So they needed some sort of coalescing belief system. We've got to save lives. COVID brings us all together. All of a sudden, a angst-ridden, existentially crisis, godless North American population got their brand new religion all in one package. To me, wearing the mask is like wearing a yarmulke, right? It's a religious symbol to comply to a group of bureaucrats who are the new priesthood. So how did we get here? Godlessness leading to Marxist education, leading to the decline of civilization, which is already in effect from just being rich, wealthy, and debauched. And then it made us very, very susceptible to something like a mass formation psychosis, right? And it says in the end times there'll be a great deception. This is probably a forerunner to the kind of great deception that's coming down the pipes. Anybody else?
I've experienced personally, and I know a lot of people, like-minded people, get called conspiracy theorists if they try to bring this up, and I know the legacy media promotes that kind of thinking too, you know, putting these ideas in people's minds that anybody who is against any of this is a conspiracy theorist and so on. Wondering if you have anything to offer us as far as how we could start these conversations with people.
Yep. No, you have to pick your right time. Sometimes it's not the time to do it. And I always like to lead with statistics because we still seem to, the other side at least claims to be following the science. So without telling them you're questioning the science, you can say, hey, look at this article from the CDC or the WHO. Because there's elements of truth in these places, and you can start a conversation that way. And then, but you have to do your homework, right? Like tonight, I know it was like drinking from a fire hose, but once we know what to say and where to find good information, because you can lead someone to knowledge, but you can't make them think. There's going to come a time where you're going to realize, okay, this person doesn't want to know. But to stay relatively insult-free, you just quietly point them to information and see how they respond. And if there's a hint of a search for truth inside of them, they'll be like, that's very interesting, and you can go from there.
Thank you.
But we will be called nuts and crazies, and I mean, Jesus was called, the Pharisees said Jesus had a demon in him. Can you imagine that? The religious leaders of the very religious system that Jesus created called the founder of their Judaism the devil. And Jesus said it right back to them. No, your father's the devil. Well, anybody else want to ask a question? One final question? Okay, down here.
Could you just clarify about the digital IDs? Because I know there's at least 2 provinces that are, excuse me, planning to launch them this fall. So my understanding is, at least initially, it'll be a voluntary thing.
Yep.
But eventually it'll be tied to the mark of the beast.
Yeah, I mean,
am I understanding that right?
A system where we cannot escape the government's control over our purchases and sales seems to be what the mark of the beast system is in Revelation. So right now, for example, the Ukraine under Zelensky proudly is boasting that they're now moving forward not only with digital ID, but now they're going to have a digital form of a driver's license. If you want to access your like benefits as an unemployed person, you can only do it through the same digital ID. They're tying something like 50 different functions that we normally would have different avenues of here, paperwork, in-person, email, all into one singular system in the Ukraine, right, which is very curious. Zelensky is also a young global leader under the WEF, by the way. So eventually, the government wants to control, because the government already has controls in the BC, for example, car insurance, our health care, our unemployment benefits, all this stuff, right? They want to add more to that system. They do want to be able to, instead of banks running the currency, they do. And they have a system which they can literally flick a switch where your account's frozen. And we're all okay with that. That's the system they're literally saying that right now in the UK. And they're alluding to it here. They want more and more of our basic functions for living and our dependence on government to be run through a singular system. And so, yeah, if the mark of the beast is what it looks like it is, it'll be something that has that incorporated into it, but it will have the added effect of once you get it, there's no mistake about it, you're also pledging allegiance to the worship of the beast. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. It's not going to be snuck up on us. We're not going to turn around. You're going to have a God-fearing Christian all of a sudden turn around and go, oh my gosh, I just got the mark of the beast. All that Christianity for nothing. I'm going to hell, right? It's not going to be like that. I hope so. I hope the pre-trib is or the pre-wrath rapture is correct. I don't have a strong view on I believe in a rapture. I'm hoping for a pre-tribulation rapture because I'm kind of cowardly sometimes. I'll be tough if I have to. I'd rather not have to be tough. Well, thank you very much for coming, and we're going to be back in 2 weeks. Feel free to join us. Thank you very much. Thank you.